He didn't think he was making a mistake. He thought he was being careful. That's the part that stayed with me, not the anger, not the money, not even what his mother said to my face in that hotel lobby. What stayed with me was how calm he looked when he handed me that envelope, like a man who had done this before, like a man who expected it to work. My name isn't important right now. What's important is that I was 31 years old, working as a paralegal at a mid-size firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I had just found out I was pregnant, not by a coworker, not by an ex-boyfriend, by a man named, I'll just call him by what he was to me, my boyfriend's father. I need to back up. I know how that sounds. I need you to stay with me, because the story is not what you think it is, and the part that matters isn't even the pregnancy. The part that matters is what his family did when they found out, and what I did the morning after. I had been dating his son, I'll call him Derek, for about 8 months. Derek was 29. We met at a charity event his firm co-sponsored. He was easy to like, funny in a self-deprecating way, thoughtful enough to remember small things, ambitious without being cruel about it. We were good together, or I thought we were. His family was old money, not flashy, but the kind of wealth that's been sitting in the same accounts for 3 generations, compounding quietly. His father, I'll call him Mr. Hargrove, ran the family's private equity holdings. His mother organized everything and everyone around her like a project manager who had never once been told no. I met Mr. Hargrove at a family dinner in the fall. Derek had described him as intense but fair. What I saw was a man who assessed every person in the room within 30 seconds of meeting them and had already decided where they ranked before the appetizers arrived. He shook my hand and asked me what law school I was planning to attend. When I told him I was a paralegal and not planning to go to law school, he nodded once and moved on. That was the first dinner. There were 4 more over the next several months. By the third one, Mr. Hargrove had started directing questions at me, real questions, not the dismissive kind. By the 4th, he was asking about specific cases I had worked on. By the 5th, Derek had left early because of a work call, and Mr. Hargrove and I had sat at that table for 2 hours talking about regulatory law and a Supreme Court case I had written a brief memo on for one of the partners at my firm. I told myself it was just intellectual respect. That's the thing about being a reasonably smart woman in rooms full of powerful men. You learn to categorize the attention they give you, sort it into boxes labeled safe and not safe, and you become very good at convincing yourself that what you're seeing is the safe version. I was wrong. I won't detail the specifics of how it happened, because they are not the point, and because I am not interested in performing shame for an audience. What I will tell you is that it happened twice, that I ended things immediately after the second time, that I told Derek nothing because I did not yet know what there was to tell, and that 6 weeks later I was sitting in my bathroom at 6 in the morning staring at a pregnancy test that was telling me my life was about to change in a way I had not prepared for. I sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time. I did not cry. I went through a kind of mental checklist that felt almost clinical: my health insurance, my savings account, my lease expiration date, the name of my OB/GYN. I was a paralegal. I knew how to organize information under pressure. What I did not know how to organize was the feeling underneath all of it, which was something quieter and stranger than fear. It was closer to clarity. I made an appointment with my doctor. I told no one. I went to work. I prepared a contract summary for a partner who barely acknowledged me. I ate lunch at my desk. I went home. I did this for 4 days. On the 5th day, I called my older sister who lives in Raleigh. She did not panic. She asked me 2 questions. Are you safe? And do you want to continue the pregnancy? The answer to both was yes. She said, okay. Then she said, you need a family law attorney before you tell anyone else. Not after, before. That was the most important sentence anyone said to me in the first month. I found an attorney through a colleague at my firm, a woman named Patricia, who had 22 years of family law experience and an office in uptown Charlotte that was quieter than I expected. I sat across from her and told her everything. I watched her face stay completely neutral throughout. When I finished, she asked me for the timeline, asked me a few specific questions about documentation, and then she folded her hands on the desk and said, before you tell the father, I want you to understand what you're dealing with. What I was dealing with, she explained, was a high-asset paternity case with a significant complicating factor. The biological father was the parent of my current partner, which created a web of family dynamics that would almost certainly be weaponized against me if I wasn't careful. She told me to document everything I could remember. She told me not to tell Derek yet. She told me to get a confirmation of paternity as early as the pregnancy allowed prenatal DNA testing was available, she said, as early as 7 weeks through a non-invasive blood draw. It wasn't cheap. It was absolutely worth it. I did not know prenatal paternity testing existed. I want to say that clearly, because one of the things I've learned through all of this is that most people don't know what's available to them, and that gap in knowledge is exactly what people like the Hargroves count on. I scheduled the test. I paid for it out of my own savings. I waited. The results came back on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at work. I opened the email in the bathroom, read the confirmation 3 times, and then I went back to my desk and finished reviewing a deposition transcript. Because I had a job and a life and I was not going to fall apart in a building where falling apart was not an option. That evening I called Patricia. She said, "Good. Now we know what we're working with, and now you can decide how to proceed." I decided to tell him directly. Not his wife, not Derek, him. I sent Mr. Hargrove a message asking to meet. He responded within an hour, which told me he had been waiting for some version of this moment. We met at a coffee shop near his office, his suggestion, neutral ground, the kind of place where nothing dramatic is supposed to happen. He was already seated when I arrived. He was wearing a suit even though it was a Saturday. He looked at me the way he had at that first dinner, assessing, sorting, ranking. He asked how I was feeling. I told him I was pregnant, and that he was the father, and that I had the documentation to confirm it. I put nothing on the table. I kept my hands in my lap. I watched his face. He didn't react the way I expected. He didn't panic. He went very still, the way a man goes still when he's shifting from one mode to another, from polite to operational. He asked if I had told anyone. I told him I had spoken with an attorney. Something moved behind his eyes. Then he said he would need a few days to think. I said I understood. I stood up, thanked him for meeting me, and left. He called 4 days later and asked if I would meet with him and his wife. I told Patricia. She said, "Go. Bring nothing. Say as little as possible. Let them talk." I met them at their home, a large, quiet house in Myers Park that smelled like fresh flowers and something expensive. His wife, I'll call her Mrs. Hargrove, was seated in the living room when I arrived. She looked like a woman who had prepared for this meeting the way she prepared for everything, completely. Her posture was perfect. Her voice, when she spoke, was controlled to a degree that I recognized immediately as the product of extreme emotion being managed rather than absent. She did not yell at me. She did not call me names. She looked at me and said, "We would like to handle this quietly." Mr. Hargrove placed an envelope on the coffee table. Inside was a cashier's check for $300,000. There was also a single-page document, a non-disclosure agreement, and a referral to a clinic in a city 2 states away. I looked at the envelope. I looked at Mrs. Hargrove. I looked at Mr. Hargrove. I said, "I appreciate you meeting with me." I left the envelope on the table. I thanked them for their time. I walked out of their house and sat in my car for a few minutes in their driveway. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I was thinking about something Patricia had said at our first meeting. Almost as a side note, in North Carolina, courts calculate child support as a percentage of combined parental income with no statutory cap for high-income earners. No cap. I thought about what percentage of Mr. Hargrove's annual income from a private equity portfolio that managed somewhere between $40 and $60 million in assets, a number I had looked up, because I was a paralegal and looking things up was what I did, would look like applied to 2 children for 18 years. I thought about the word quietly. I drove home. I called Patricia. I said, "They made an offer." She said, "Did you sign anything?" I said no. She said, "Good. Are you ready to file?" I said yes. The next morning, Patricia's assistant called a licensed process server. By noon, Mr. Hargrove had been served at his office building. His assistant apparently had to interrupt a meeting to bring him the envelope. Patricia told me this without any particular tone, the way she told me most things, like information, not commentary. Derek found out 2 days later. I don't know exactly how, but I suspect his mother told him. He called me 7 times in one afternoon. I let it go to voicemail each time. On the 8th call I answered. He asked me if it was true. I said yes. Lo said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry," and hung up. That was the last time we spoke. I want to tell you that the legal process was simple and clean and that justice moved quickly and I felt good the entire time. None of that is true. The legal process was slow and expensive, and there were weeks when I was so tired I fell asleep at my desk during lunch. Mr. Hargrove's attorneys filed for a contested paternity hearing even with the DNA confirmation, a delay tactic that Patricia had anticipated. They submitted filings, questioning the circumstances of the testing, questioning the timeline, questioning everything that could be questioned. I was 7 months pregnant when we finally got to the hearing. My daughter and then, 20 minutes later, my second daughter were born on a March morning that was colder than I expected for North Carolina spring. I was alone in the hospital except for my sister, who had driven down from Raleigh and slept in the waiting room chair. I named them myself. I had been deciding on names for months. The nurses were kind. The room was bright. It was one of the hardest and most completely clear days of my life. Patricia filed the formal child support petition 6 weeks postpartum, as we had planned. By then, Mr. Hargrove's legal team had cycled through 2 rounds of continuances and seemed to believe they could outlast me. What they did not account for was that I had spent the previous 18 months organizing every document, every date, every correspondence into a folder system that Patricia later told me was the most thorough client preparation she had seen in 22 years of practice. The hearing lasted 2 days. I sat at the plaintiff's table and watched Mr. Hargrove's attorney argue, with a straight face, that his client's private equity distributions should be considered irregular income and not subject to full percentage calculation. Patricia's response was methodical and completely devastating. She had pulled 3 years of tax filings obtained through discovery and walked the court through exactly what irregular income had averaged, annually, over that period. The judge was a woman in her late 50s who asked very few questions and took very precise notes. When she did speak, it was to ask Mr. Hargrove's attorney to clarify a specific figure. He clarified. She wrote it down. She did not smile or frown. She simply recorded. The final support order came on a Thursday afternoon, in a document Patricia emailed to me at my desk. I opened it at my desk. I read it twice. I set my phone face down and finished the contract review I was working on. Then I went to the parking garage and sat in my car and allowed myself 5 minutes of crying, which was not sadness and not triumph, and was something that doesn't really have a clean name. Something like relief that has been compressed for so long it comes out at high pressure. The order required monthly payments that would cover my daughter's housing, childcare, healthcare, education savings, and a reasonable standard of living, not extravagant, not symbolic, real, sustainable, for 18 years. Mr. Hargrove did not look pale exactly at the hearing. He looked like a man who had spent a long time operating in a world where money made things go away, and who was now sitting in a room where that mechanism had simply stopped working. I don't take pleasure in describing that. I'm describing it because I think it's important to name what it looks like when a system works the way it's supposed to, when the documentation is there, when the attorney is good, when the process is followed, and the outcome is fair. It doesn't look like drama. It looks quiet, almost mundane. A judge, a document, a Thursday afternoon. What I want to say to you, and I mean this for anyone who is sitting somewhere right now with information they're afraid to act on, an offer on a table they feel pressured to take, a voice telling them that the quieter path is the wiser one, is this: quiet and powerless are not the same thing. I was quiet the entire time. I left that envelope on the table without raising my voice. I answered Derek's calls calmly or not at all. I sat in that hearing for 2 days and spoke when spoken to. I was, by any external measure, composed. But composed is not the same as compliant, and patience is not the same as surrender. My daughters are 15 months old now. They are loud and opinionated and entirely themselves in a way that no amount of money could have prevented, and no document in a hotel lobby could have erased. My older sister came to visit last month and spent most of the trip on the floor playing with them while I made dinner. It was an ordinary evening. It was the kind of ordinary evening that I protected when I walked out of that house in Myers Park, with an unsigned envelope on the coffee table behind me. That's the thing about the offer they make you, the quiet offer, the clean-it-up offer, the let's handle this privately offer. They always frame it as the easier path, and maybe it is easier in the short term. No hearings, no depositions, no Thursdays at your desk opening court documents and crying in parking garages. But easier for whom? That's the question I kept returning to. Easier for them. Easier for the system they'd built around themselves. Easier for the story they wanted to keep telling about who they were and what they were allowed to do. Not easier for me. Not easier for my daughters. I don't think of what I did as brave exactly, Bravery implies I wasn't afraid. I was afraid constantly of the legal fees, of the timeline, of what Derek might do, of what a judge might decide, of whether my documentation was thorough enough, of whether I was reading the situation correctly, of 1,000 things that kept me awake more nights than I want to count. What I think it actually was informed. I had a good attorney who told me the truth about my options early, before anyone could pressure me into a decision. I had a sister who told me to make the call before I told anyone else. I had enough professional knowledge to know that documentation matters, and that the earlier you build it, the better. And I had a strong enough sense of my own future and my daughter's futures to understand that $300,000, one time, was not the same thing as a fair and legally binding commitment to the financial welfare of 2 children for 18 years. The math, when you lay it out plainly, is not complicated. What they were offering was a transaction. What I filed for was accountability. Those are different things. And accountability, it turns out, does not have a cap. If you're in a situation where someone with more power and more resources is trying to convince you that the quiet path is your best option, I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not the fear of it, but the mechanics of it. Who benefits from your silence? What does the offer actually solve? And for whom? Is the person across the table offering you something? Or offering themselves a way out? Get an attorney before you tell anyone. Document everything. Know your options before someone else defines them for you. The envelope is still on their coffee table as far as I'm concerned. I never touched it. I never needed to.